All right. All right. Hello and welcome everyone to our CoachX Conversation. I am Pamela Larde. I'm the Director of Education here at the Institute of Coaching. And it is my pleasure to be joined by Richard Tedeschi. And we are going to be talking about this concept of, we're going to be looking at post-traumatic growth, but we're also going to be really talking about expert companionship. And what does that mean? I've already had people reaching out. What is that? What is that? So this is good. People are curious. But just to give you a little bit about Dr. Tedeschi, he is Professor Emeritus in the Department of Psychological Sciences at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. And I'll just say for quite a while, his work has been really foundational to my own work. So I've always looked at this Center for Post-Traumatic Growth that was at Charlotte and thinking, I've got to get there somehow. I've got to get there somehow to learn more about this work. He has published 9 books and numerous professional articles on trauma, bereavement, and on post-traumatic growth, which is a term that he coined and introduced to the psychological literature while he was at the University of North Carolina. He is currently the executive director at the Boulder Crest Foundation, and we're going to learn a little bit more about what that's all about. So I want to just go ahead and dive into this conversation. Rich, thank you so much for agreeing to this. You did a webinar a couple of weeks ago. And so we are just really following up on some of the wonderful things that came out of the webinar. But thank you and welcome.
It's a pleasure to be here and look forward to our conversation and any questions that people have.
Yes, absolutely. So I have to start with just a little bit of on a personal level. I had the opportunity to join Rich and other members of the Boulder Crest team 2 weeks ago in DC for a summit that was just really powerful. It was powerful to see people from all across the country doing work in this area in so many different ways. And so can you tell us a little bit about the Boulder Crest Foundation and what it is that they seek to do with post-traumatic growth?
Well, the foundation was developed back in 2013 as a way to serve military service members, veterans, and first responders who had experienced traumatic incidents in their lives and in their work. Originally because the founder, Ken Falk, a Navy veteran, had been visiting the wounded warriors at Walter Reed and Bethesda Naval Hospital, and he was looking for a way to serve them better. And actually his wife, Julia, had the idea of building this campus near their home to create a retreat center for them. And out of that, Ken and I met and started developing programs based on the post-traumatic growth concept. And we've been working together ever since. And we have now a campus in Arizona as well. And we have 8 other partners around the country who provide these programs. We train their staff. Other retreat centers do this. And we also have programs that we deliver for first responders in various cities around the country, for firefighters and police officers primarily, EMTs also. And right now, the biggest programs we have are going on in Miami and Tucson. So we've got a lot happening through Boulder Crest, and I found it to be just a very inspiring place to work and great people to work with.
I love it. I love it. I mean, it says a lot to even, say that you're working with another organization to, really operationalize this idea of post-traumatic growth, because some people create the concept and they kind of want to lay low, but you've creating the concept and you've agreed to get your hands dirty and be a part of the operationalizing of it. Now, so tell us what post-traumatic growth is. And part of that definition, if you can tell us how you all define trauma, because there's a lot of different ways people define it. But what is that definition of trauma that you all really work with? And then what is post-traumatic growth?
Okay, good. So basically, instead of talking about trauma in terms of certain events that meet a criteria for being bad enough, we define trauma following on the work of Ronnie Janoff Bowman, University of Massachusetts, who talked about the shattering of the assumptive world or core belief systems. And so traumatic events are the ones that call into question the essential beliefs that we've always held that help us navigate our lives in the world. Beliefs about the kind of world we live in, the kind of people we are, our futures that we think we have ahead of us. And traumatic events are the ones that hit us, and we end up saying, I don't understand it anymore. I can't believe this happened. Where do I go from here? Who am I now? What does my future hold? What kind of world am I living in? Those kinds of things start to happen. And that's very anxiety rousing, very confusing. But it also can set the stage for people to reconsider all those things. And in the process, come up with a new way of seeing the world, seeing their lives, seeing themselves, new perspectives that can lead them in directions they might not have gone before. And that's the post-traumatic growth we're talking about, where people, as a result of this struggle in the aftermath of trauma, find positive outcomes that lead to things like improved relationships, new opportunities for themselves, a better appreciation for living life, some spiritual and existential change and development and wisdom, and a greater sense of personal strength. So these are the kind of outcomes that we sometimes see as a result of that struggle with the core belief system that's been shattered.
So what's interesting to me, and I want to tie this to coaching with Lisa's comment here. So Lisa Williams is saying it as a certified coach, trauma is such a part of people's lives. And as you may have heard, this is a lively debate in the coaching world. You know, oh, we shouldn't touch trauma. We shouldn't touch trauma. And I love that Lisa beautifully articulates here that trauma is a part of our lives. So even as you're talking about a traumatic event that can change the way we see our futures, a book that I'm working on now looks at being single and what that means and how people became single sometimes is traumatic, divorce, loss of a spouse, and so forth. And it does change the way you see your future. So to not make it, like you said, this massive event, but something that more changes the way we see our world is essential. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about coaching and how that trauma can be relevant to our work as coaches as well.
Well, this is where we get to the expert companionship thing. Because my colleague at Charlotte, Lawrence Calhoun, and I, Lawrence worked as hard as I did on all of this, so give him credit.
Yes.
We determined that when we talked to people who had been through trauma, who told us about their stories and what they went through, there was often the kind of support in their lives that allowed them to start to explore the possibilities for growth. And these, we ended up calling them expert companions. These expert companions were people who weren't necessarily professionals at all. They were people who had the expertise at being companions, who had the expertise of being able to listen closely to people, to see the best in people, to see possibilities forward, to avoid being advice givers, and prematurely try to solve problems for people, who were patient, who had these kinds of characteristics that can be found in all sorts of folks, family members, friends, coworkers, teachers, coaches, therapists, all sorts of folks. So you don't have to be you don't have to be certified necessarily as a professional to be an expert companion. So coaches surely fit into that mold. As so some coaches might be really expert at companionship, and other coaches may not be so expert at companionship. Just like some therapists are expert in this companionship, and others are not so much. So um, we we've tried to describe the kind of person and the kind of the kind of relationship that's involved in this expert companionship. So, um, all those coaches out there listening to us who are interested in working in the area of trauma, I think um, it would be important for them to think about how they develop these kinds of relationships.
So I already know that something you said might be a little bit of a trigger for some of the coaches. So I want to dive into that just a little bit. But when you said that you don't have to be, certified to be an expert companion, maybe walk us through what it looks like to be an expert companion, so we can better understand sort of the day to day of what that person might be to somebody who's
Right.
been experienced trauma.
And the reason I said that is because um, it's not a question of what degree you have. Um, it's the question of how you approach people and how you relate to people.
Hmm.
And if I think if you talk to a lot of people who have gone through therapy, for example, you'll find people who talk about maybe the good therapists they've had and the ones that weren't. Um, so, and a lot of that is about how people handle the relationship.
Mm.
So, the same for coaches. And and so the expert companion is not necessarily someone with a degree, but it is someone who is first of all approaching this person they'd like to help as a learner.
Mm.
You've probably heard of the idea of the beginner's mind, and so this is um, really focusing so much on what the other person says about their experience that you don't bring your preconceived notions into things. Instead, you learn from that person as if they're kind of human being you've never met before, because indeed they are. They're unique, and their experience is unique. So you want to be a learner, and therefore you want to listen closely, and you also want to, as an expert companion, listen for the ways that people are changing in the direction of growth, in the
Mm.
direction of something new in their lives that's starting to open up, some new ways of understanding themselves and their lives. Um, and and one thing that we emphasize at Boulder Crest a lot, and I think is important in this, listen for how people want to take their experiences and take themselves and do something useful and constructive with it,
Right.
to be of service in some way, to have a mission, to have a purpose, to make all this meaningful rather than meaningless suffering. So you listen for that, and you try to help people build on that by pointing
Mm.
out, hey, here's I'm hearing this from you. Maybe we need to talk more about that. What is it you're thinking here? And just encourage that kind of exploration. So
Yeah.
it's a lot of listening, it's a lot of learning, it's a lot of exploration.
I love that you said make it meaningful suffering. I mean, because we're going to suffer. And as you've mentioned before, the human experience, that's a part of the human experience. But to make that a meaningful thing, and it doesn't have to look like creating a Boulder Crest Foundation. It could be in your day-to-day interactions with people that are life-changing.
That's absolutely right, Pam. So, sometimes people hear about this stuff and they think, oh, does this mean that we have some expectation that people are going to, you know, create a, you know, cure for cancer, or the next great foundation? Or I mean, no, it doesn't have to be like that at all. What's meaningful can exist on a very kind of circumscribed personal level,
Yeah.
like you're suggesting, one to one, affecting individual people's lives. So it varies. Everybody's different in terms of where they go with their personal development. So what we want to do is encourage them to do something that they see themselves as important, and they have a sense of purpose about it, so that what they've been through isn't just in vain.
Yeah. I mean, it could be that your parenting, for example, becomes so transformative that it changes the trajectory of your children's lives, you know? So
Sure.
it could be, I mean, there's so many ways to look at it. So I just want to relieve people of that pressure thinking, if I experience post-traumatic growth, I need to be out there, you know, changing the world. And that does happen, but it doesn't always look exactly like that.
Yeah,
So,
hopefully you do something to have a positive influence on your corner of the world.
right.
I think that's important.
Yeah.
But I think that a lot of these changes that we see in post-traumatic growth naturally lead people in the direction to be better people, frankly.
Right. So one of the things that I also heard you say is that, and I've heard you say this a couple of times now, that post-traumatic growth is an age-old concept. You know, you did the research and you have the empirical parts of it, but can you talk about it as something that existed before, you know, you and Calhoun coined the term?
Right. You know, when we were writing a book on this, our first book was called Trauma and Transformation. And when we were writing the book, we hadn't even coined the term yet, actually. But we wanted to take all these interviews and things that we had done with people and, you know, the messages we were getting from this and the process and try to describe it. And when we were writing it, first thing we did was we went to philosophy and literature and religion. And because it's there that um, we thought we had heard a lot of similar kinds of ideas and concepts. And so, you know, post-traumatic growth has been around since there's been people experiencing trauma. So Lord knows how long that's been. Um, because if there weren't positive outcomes as a result of these kinds of events, where would we be as a human race? You know, I mean, we wouldn't have gotten anywhere. I think we've gotten somewhere. Sometimes I wonder, but you know, I think we're stumbling into a good direction generally.
Yeah.
So it's, you know, so let's just take Christianity for example. Uh, if you think about Christianity, it is a post-traumatic growth religion because out of Christ's crucifixion comes the redemption and the salvation,
Hmm.
right?
Right.
So there's that. In Buddhism, you find the noble truths. In Buddhism is all about what you do with suffering.
Mm.
Um, you know, so we find these things, these kinds of concepts throughout the stories of humanity. And what we did was we tried to put a label on it so that people could do some empirical work on this within, you know, within psychology and related disciplines.
Right. And I love that because, you know, not often do we hear researchers acknowledge that, you know, this is something that's embedded in people's cultures and their beliefs. And this is something that, you know, we didn't necessarily discover, but we're giving language to it so that we can better understand it, so we can be intentional about how we create it. And so I really appreciate your willingness to do that. I do see a question here that I think I'd love for you to answer. They're asking if post-traumatic growth relates to how individuals are operating based on how we intake the world events, like political events, war, weather impact, and so forth.
So if I understand, I'll try to answer the question, see if I understand it right. So if we are processing events from this perspective of post-traumatic growth, I think we're more likely to see the possibilities in them and be more hopeful
Mm.
about the future because we have, through our own personal experience, seen that terrible things aren't the end of the story.
Yeah.
And so, for the world out there where terrible things are happening, I think we're more likely to say to ourselves, that can't be the end of the story. There's got to be more that will come
Hmm.
and better that will come after this. And also, I want to make something clear that reminds me of something I think is important, and that is these terrible events that lead to growth outcomes aren't good things in themselves. And we're not saying that post traumatic growth is caused by traumatic events. Post traumatic growth comes out of what people do in the aftermath of these events. And
Hmm.
that's why in our work, we don't focus on the traumas themselves so much as what people are doing in the aftermath, how people are searching for something better and new and redemptive
Hmm.
in the aftermath of these events. So we're not saying these horrible things are good for people. We're
Right.
saying they're terrible, but people have an opportunity to do something different and more and redemptive with them.
I think it's so profound that you're saying that because I mean, I've heard cases made where it's like, well, it's good that we had the slave trade because now look at where you all are in your lives. And it's, I mean, and that's a very extreme example, but we hear people say things like this. And so I think that's an important distinction that you're making here.
Well, I make that distinction because I've occasionally gotten messages, people send me stuff. I've heard messages from people saying things like, I can't believe you're saying war is a good thing. I'm saying to myself,
Mm.
what? It's like,
Right.
no, I never said that. And this is not what this is about. Completely misunderstanding.
Yeah.
So I think that's important that you bring that up.
Very important. Yes. There's some really good questions here about grief. And I actually wanted to touch on that because when you talk about expert companionship, one of the things that I heard you say, and please correct me if I understood it incorrectly. But in the webinar, you mentioned that sometimes people are pressured to get over the grief. Like you've been grieving for 3 months now, or there's these, and as you recently said that there's been recent changes in the expectation for how long it should take people to overcome grief. And one of the things that I thought I was just wowed out loud about was when you said that the way people handle grief, in a lot of ways, has to do with the people around them and the expert companionship that they might experience, and how that changes the way they handle grief. One of the questions that's in the box here is about the 5 stages of grief and or the sixth, and whether or not there's a time frame, or a point at which one of those stages we are supposed to then interject with the expert companionship, or if post-traumatic growth is sort of indicative of one of those particular stages. So it's a lot of words, but can you
Okay.
talk about grief and
Yeah.
expert companionship and the stages of grief?
Well, using that trigger word, you've triggered me.
I know, I know.
You've triggered me. And I'll tell you what. I'll tell you why, Pam. Because um, I I have a lot of trouble with the stages of grief concept.
Hmm.
Um, you know, I and I'm not trying to sound like an expert, but I I worked for 25 years doing support groups for bereaved parents weekly for a nonprofit, Charlotte. And those parents, all those stories, resonate with me. They've taught me a lot. And one thing they taught me is the 5 stages of grief are baloney.
Mm.
Um, they I don't know how many people had said things like, I went online, I read there's these stages of grief, my grief is not following that pattern. There must be something terribly wrong with me because I'm not going through this. I said, because grief is messy, it's convoluted, it's individual, it doesn't follow a linear course.
Right.
So I think maybe it's been misapplied. I don't know, but it hasn't been a useful concept, I
Mhm.
don't think, in my work with grieving people. Um, However, there are pieces of it in terms of the emotions that people experience that are worth looking at. People experience all kinds of emotions, all mixed up together and at different times. People experience anger, yes, sometimes they experience sadness, certainly. You know, they have to come to some point where, they continue with their lives in spite of what had happened. You can call that acceptance, I guess. I mean,
Mhm.
but to mechanize this is a mistake. Let's pay closer attention to the experience of the individual person and not expect them to follow some kind of course like this. And in terms of post-traumatic growth, we're not going to be giving them message that, okay, you've got to make some growth out of this experience.
Right.
That's not something I would never do. Um, you follow people's lead, see where they're going, and again, highlight the natural course which might lead them to some changes that are potentially valuable and help them build on that. But that doesn't mean that their sadness goes away entirely.
Mm.
Um, they still have lost someone they loved, and there'll always be pain. So post-traumatic growth doesn't erase pain, but it makes it into something that has some value and is not just continued suffering and misery, that there's another part of the story. So that's what we hope that people can discover in this process, or not discover, but create for themselves, because it's a creative process.
Right. Right. And can you talk a little bit about how the role of expert companionship seems to change that process of grieving that people might have?
Well, it encourages people to try to articulate their experience, which is, I think, important part of moving forward, is try to express what it is that's going on rather than hold it in.
Hmm.
So this expression is important, and I think that's what coaches, good coaches do. They're there to help people express things that are difficult to express,
Right.
and sometimes express them in words, sometimes express them in other kinds of ways that are individualized in someone's music, and someone's art, someone's physical activity, or
Mm.
whatever it might be. Discover a way to express this. So that's important. And for people in that expression to discover their own creativity, their own humanity, and and then as they learn about what it's like to be a, a person in pain, they might start to feel more compassion for other people in pain.
Mm.
And through that compassion, you become someone who has an impact in this world that's really positive.
Mm.
So those are some things that can start to happen.
Yeah, and we've talked about grief and another, I guess, really pressing issue, which we can probably do a whole webinar on this, is that of suicide. And had the honor of sitting next to somebody, Melinda Moore,
Yes.
who was really doing a lot of work in that area. And then recently, last week, we saw another highly visible individual take his life. Twitch as
Right.
was part of the Ellen show. And it's such a devastating tragedy that we really don't understand fully. Is there a role? Because one of the things I hear often is, well, check on your strong friends, check on your people you think is happy. And one of the things that Melinda Moore made very clear is that it always isn't, that's not always the solution, because there are people that are just internally suffering. Are there internal tools that people can take on when they are considering suicide? Because a lot of them will write notes to the people that are checking on them and say, I'm sorry, I had to do this. So it makes me think, then, are there tools that the individual person who's considering suicide might be able to utilize as it pertains to post-traumatic growth? Or is that just, me being just super hopeful that we can fix this problem?
Well, yeah, I'm not sure we're ever going to totally fix the problem,
Yeah,
but maybe you can fix it to some extent, right?
right.
So, I mean, there is research that shows that post-traumatic growth is essentially a protective factor for suicidality. That
Mm,
when people have that kind of meaning in their lives and they're doing something for other people, it's a protective factor.
yeah.
But it doesn't solve the problem, like we see with Twitch. I mean, a lot of people, um, we're so um, affected by his work and his message, and felt like they were in relationship with him even though they never met him. I mean, he had incredible impact, and still that didn't save him.
Right.
He seemed to live a very meaningful life, and it didn't save him from taking his own life.
Right.
So it's not something that's going to solve the problem, but I think it can help a lot of people um, find that um, if they can think about their impact on other people and the reason that they need to be here, to be in the lives of other people in positive and beneficial ways, um, it can play a role in making sure that people stick with us and continue to do their good work.
Yeah. And it's probably unfair to throw that question at you at the very end because, it's such a big question. And we are in the last minute of of this conversation that went way too fast. But I just wanted to know if you had any parting words for coaches as we wrap up.
Well, I think that we try to highlight here expert companionship, and that's the thing I want you to take from it, and your way of connecting with individuals in a deep fashion of learning from them, wanting to know them, and encouraging them to express themselves. That's some of the best work that you can do, and it can help people move towards growth.
I love that. I love that. And so now I think as we think about post-traumatic growth, it's important for us to think about expert companionship as the two going hand in hand. This is a new term for a lot of us, especially those who have worked with trauma. So I appreciate you bringing this to us and showing us what it looks like, that it's really about that relationship that you establish with people rather than necessarily your degrees or your credentialing. Build that relationship. But thank you so much for joining us today, Rich. We will continue to answer questions in the chat box as they come through. So this will be up forever. So thank you. And I wish you all a wonderful rest of the week.
Thank you, Pam. Enjoyed seeing you again.
Yes, great seeing you.